If your idea of adventurous sex is having sex with the lights on, maybe this podcast is not for you.
Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh.
On the show today, Jessica Graham. So Jessica Graham is someone I rate very highly as a sex and relationship coach, workshop leader, someone I've done some work with personally. I appreciate what they do. Meditation teacher, really coming from a very solid meditation background, most under Shinzen Young. We've had on a couple of times the podcast. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
How did you get interested in the body? What was the beginning of your journey?
Well, I would say that I was incredibly interested in the body from a very young age, but that I got really cut off from it through trauma and then addiction and all that fun stuff in my childhood and teen years and early 20s. And then when I started in earnest on my kind of healing / spiritual journey, I was reintroduced to my body in a really big way and found out that I'd been pretty much living from the neck up and was introduced to all kinds of really painful experiences in the body, but also a lot of pleasure that I'd been missing out on because I'd been so concerned with avoiding the pain.
Okay. And I know we should talk about you as a movie star, you as an author. This book, Good Sex, Getting Off Without Checking Out. What a great title. We'll come to that. So sort of what was the journey between the kind of painful childhood and, you know, working in film, science fiction stuff, you've been in all sorts, and then you becoming a mindfulness teacher and working particularly with sex and sexuality. Let's hear a little bit about what happened between.
So I was introduced to meditation at a very young age when I was about 5 or 6. My mom was teaching me visualization and mindfulness of breath exercises along with some other stuff that I don't really have a huge amount of memory around, but I do remember my 6th birthday, and there's a photo of this. I wanted everyone at my party, which were mostly adults, I think, to stand in a circle, hold hands, close their eyes, and meditate. And there's a picture of me in like a Mickey Mouse shirt with my eyes closed, holding my grandparents' hands. And so I was very, very into this sort of thing. And I had a lot of what I would now call spiritual experiences when I was a kid and then throughout my life before I started meditating. The other thing I was really interested in as a kid was sex, and I just found it fascinating. And part of that was based on kind of early sexualization and some trauma, and some of that was just the way that I came out. Like I was just interested. But then, you know, I grew up in an alcoholic home, mental illness, neglect, abuse, all of this stuff. And it was a long line of that on both sides of my family for my parents and their parents and their parents. And so I already had the trauma wired in before anything even happened to me. Yeah. By the time I was about 14, I was on my own more or less. And I sort of went in and out of living with my dad, but living with my dad was like living with a party buddy in college or something. You know, we drank together and we partied together, and he would leave town for long periods of time and I'd be on my own. And so about 14 is when I kind of really went into survival mode. And so I worked and I drank. That was pretty much what I did. And I had sex. Those were the things I did. And the thing that kept my head above water, I would say, throughout that time was that I did love acting. And I would do a film or a play, and that would kind of keep me in a place of not going, you know, just totally over the edge. And so I would say in some ways that really saved my life. I got really far away from anything meditation related. And while my sex life was very adventurous and fun, it was pretty shut down. And a lot of my sexual experiences were when I was intoxicated, because I was intoxicated most of the time. I kept acting, and every so often I would find myself doing something meditation related, but I didn't really necessarily recognize it as such. Like I would find myself in a church sitting silently, you know, no one else in there, an empty church. I would just be sitting there in the silence, having an experience that I didn't really understand, or looking up at the night sky, or looking at a campfire, things like this. And I, now in hindsight, I realize those were, they were meditative experiences, and some of them were actually peak experiences. I just didn't have a name for them. Mm-hmm. So, in my 20s, I kind of got it together to a certain point, but at least on the outside, people weren't worried they were going to find me in a ditch anymore. But on the inside, things were kind of getting bad. I was not able to function in relationships. I was constantly stressed out. I was waking up with bits of tooth in my mouth because I was grinding my teeth so hard. People were telling me I should meditate. And this was before meditation was the popular thing that it is today, before Mindfulness, And so for people to be telling me that, who knew nothing about meditation, gives you an idea of kind of how stressed out I was. It wasn't until I actually got sober that I started really actually meditating. And it was through my now good friend and colleague, Michael Taft. He was teaching a class at my then boyfriend's house. And he called me a chicken because I hadn't come to the class. And he said, "Oh, you're a chicken. That's why you're not coming." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I'll show you." And I showed up at the class, and by the second class, I think it was the second class, he sat me down and he's like, "I just want you to know that your life is about to be destroyed. From the things you're sharing in the class, things are about to change in some pretty dramatic ways." And I was like, okay, cool. Like, I really had no context for what he was talking about. I knew nothing about Buddhism. I knew nothing about like the classical spiritual path. I just knew that sounded interesting. And so I think of that as my like red pill or blue pill moment from the Matrix. And I was like, give me that red pill. And then everything changed. My life was destroyed, and in the best ways. There were just huge paradigm shifts that never went back. And part of that was discovering that my sex life, while, like I said, was fun and exciting and all of that, was pretty cut off from the body, pretty cut off from any sort of real connection with myself or the other person. And so I started to bring the tools of mindfulness that I'd been learning from Michael and then from Shinzen into sex. And I started with bringing that into sex with myself because my partner at the time wasn't available for that. And then it just kind of went from there. And, the rest is history.
Yeah, your basic definition of well-being earlier there of people weren't worrying that they would find you in a ditch. There's a low bar. Jessica, I've ever heard one. And also this idea that embodied or spiritual practice can destroy your life. Now, you said that with a certain Hollywood flair, but there's a truth to that, isn't there? That the life business as normal will be disrupted by serious practice, particularly if you have addictive habits, which many people do, or sort of more or less healthy behaviors.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the thing, like I teach meditation, and I have some people I work with who really were just doing a little bit of relaxation at the beginning of a coaching session. And then I have other people who come to me because they've had some pretty significant insight or awakening, and they're sort of freaking out. I need to know, like, what do I do now? And again, it's like, I see the side effects of this stuff, and I've certainly experienced it myself. And it's no joke, but it's not this like terrifying thing where you're going to like break your mind unless there's already, in most cases, I think unless there's already some stuff going on there. You just need really good guidance. You need somebody who knows how to guide you through the pit of the void, somebody that knows how to guide you through, the superiority that can sometimes come in when you think you've like surpassed other humans, someone who can guide you through the sort of meaninglessness that can come in, the emptiness and all of that. And so, yeah, I've personally been through a few phases of that. In the beginning, it was like, oh my God, like I don't care about anything I cared about anymore. I don't care about being an actor. I don't care about, being the best or whatever it is. And I thought that was my dark night of the soul. I had no idea what was in store for me, and what it really is to like get slapped up the side the head over and over again with emptiness. And interestingly, sex was one of the things that I held out on. Like I was like, this is the thing that emptiness is not going to steal from me. This is the thing that like awakening is not going to take. This is the thing I'm going to hold on to. And I did a pretty good job of that for a while until like I wrote a book and started working with other people, and which meant obviously I was doing deeper work around my own sexuality. And then that too. And so the relationships with all of parts of self, including the sexual part of self, get destroyed, and then they get reconstructed in a very different way.
Yeah, before we go into sort of sex as our main topic, the Dark Night stuff's pretty interesting. Is I've had a couple of these, including one last year that I went to sort of Shinzen with. Can be really, meditation can be quite disruptive, both to the level of your life, of like, the guy just waking up in the office one day and just going, why am I doing this? I no longer relate to these people around me, through to not, really serious consciousness stuff. I mean, I had a month or two where I was barely functioning, in terms of just my general experiences. And this is not something it says on the Mindfulness app. When it's like, I'll do 10 minutes this every day and you'll get a bit of stress relief, which is true. But there's a pretty much anyone who seriously meditates hits some heavy stuff, which even with good guidance is challenging, and without it can be disastrous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important to talk about because it's not mentioned on the apps. In fact, one app, one of the really popular apps uses a quote of mine, which I'm going to misquote myself right now, but it's something like, swim out until you can't see land, and then keep swimming and drop below the depths, or something like this. I'm not sure where they got this quote. Maybe it's from an article I wrote, but they put it on their social media sometimes, and people flip out. Like they lose it. Like there are the people who are like, this is amazing. Yeah. And then there's people like, this is a horrible idea. Like it's like, it hits some chord inside of them that's like, we're not doing that. And it's very interesting because, I'm glad this app keeps putting it up, because it says that they do consider meditation to be deeper than just like better sleep and less stress.
I keep doing what I'm doing now, but slightly more efficiently and slightly less stressed. And what do you mean disrupting my health? It's no, I'm fine. I just need a bit less stress.
Exactly. Yeah. But you sit down and you look at your mind for long enough, like things get pretty weird. I've had more psychedelic experiences on meditation than I ever had on drugs.
Yeah.
I really have, like full on hallucinations that seem more real than the microphone I'm looking at right now, and not everybody has that. I think that's really important to say, is like, not everybody has these sorts of experiences. Not everybody has a dark night experience. Not everybody has a super blissful, amazing experience. For some people, it's just, you just sit there and slowly over time, there's a shift. And then for some of us, we have a more dramatic experience. And I've seen oftentimes people who have a history of trauma, especially childhood trauma, and people who have a history of drug and alcohol, especially drugs, use, can tend to have more of this. And that's not, I'm generalizing here, but that's just what I've noticed. It does kind of change your relationship to everything. The things you thought you loved, the things you thought you hated. When I was younger, I was incredibly into black and white. And like, if you were a politician that said this, then you were evil and bad and you deserved to be killed. And if you're a politician that said this, then I was going to celebrate you. And that's just one example. And I just can't see things that way anymore. Like,
yeah, it sounds like how most of the world now see politics. But
well, it is. And that's why for me, any spiritual practice that is leading you towards more duality, that's leading you more towards black and white, it's not doing its job. Like, because ultimately what this should be doing is blasting out our ability to have those hard views. At least that's been my experience. Like that doesn't mean that I don't have my preferences. That doesn't mean that, there are things that I would support and things I wouldn't support in the world. But like on an emotional level, like I can't separate those out. In fact, So I love something that Ajashanti said years ago when I guess it was George Bush, George W. He said to a group of people at a party, now I wasn't there, this is through a recording of his wife Mukti talking about this, but I'll quote her quoting him, if you can't see God in George W., then your awakening is not complete.
Yeah, and I definitely have this. I've tried putting that around Trump to people, and they really don't like it.
No, they don't. They don't like it at all.
Fairly serious practitioners have just looked at me with pure hate when I've said that.
And it's just ridiculous. Like, to me, that's ridiculous. It's like, look, I understand you might not be there, right? Like someone might not be at that place, and that I have full compassion for 100%. But that it's a place to aspire towards, and it's certainly the otherwise it's a contradiction of the whole path, I think.
Yeah, and I have another version of that, which is surely you can at least see the funny side of this, and because there's always a funny side, and I've been in some pretty heavy situations that still had a funny side. And that's another time where I go, okay, something's off, something's missing. Or, it might be me, it might be someone else, like my own sense of humor is missing around something. Or as you say, not being able to at least see the divine, the love, that side of things, even if it's like I passionately disagree with this person's policies or whatever it is.
Yeah. And you can passionately disagree and at the same time be open to the possibility that there's zero separation, even if you haven't had that experience. If you're on any kind of spiritual path, maybe you haven't had that experience of no separation, maybe you're not living in non-dual awareness, but there's enough teaching and literature out there that points at it, that you can open up to the possibility that maybe there is no separation between you and Trump.
And this does bring us back around nicely to sex. And I want to come back to sort of how you came in just before, though, which was this idea that there can be kind of holdouts from the practice or parts of your life. For example, a few years back, I realized that I was eating in a very disembodied way. I wasn't feeling my body. I was eating addictively, and I just hadn't clocked that. And I was like, this is something I do 3 to 10 times a day, and hadn't clocked that that was a holdout. And the same with sexuality. For me, for a long time, it was like, look, this is just my fun. This is just where I have fun. It's not an embodiment practice. It's not a spiritual practice. It's just where I have fun. No, I don't want to do tantra. No, I don't. There was a real resistance to like, okay, this is my playground, and I don't want all that stuff I'm learning to come into this part of my life. You know what I mean? These for some people, it's money. That's a big one for a lot of people. There's a real tantra of money, I think. But sex and food seem to be pretty common. Do you know what I mean? These sort of holdouts that's like, well, I'm very spiritual, except when, or I'm very in my body from an Embodiment Podcast point of view, except when. And then there's an area that gets a sort of free pass, as it were.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the thing with the area of sex is that, like, I hear a bunch of self-awareness in what you're saying. You're like, yeah, like I didn't want to bring mindfulness into this part. For a lot of people, it's like, it's not even that. Like they're not even considering that they're not doing it. And I think the reason for this is because in the area of sex, we just don't talk about it. We are more and more these days, but it's still just something that's not spoken about. And it's certainly not in like the mindfulness world, unless it's in some really specific sort of sterile way.
Well,
and
yeah,
so
Kabat-Zinn started with raisins, not blowjobs, didn't he? Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like there's a taboo there, but isn't it also about the nature of the stimuli that sex tends to be a very strong stimuli which will grab us and take us into mindlessness much more easily than a raisin. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Take us in a way.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. And of course, it will also bring us into craving and aversion much more than a raisin will, most likely, which I get that. But, isn't the whole point to like, to keep working towards liberation, right? Towards freedom. And how do you do that without, in my opinion, without actually encountering the things that are putting you in chains? So, there are holdouts. Sex is a big one. It's why we see so much sexual misconduct in spiritual community, because it's not getting talked about. But then, of course, there's, all the power exchanges that happen in those situations, which can certainly fuel sexuality, the transference that can happen in those situations. But then if you're not talking about sex, then, it's going to cause problems. I know for me, like with clients, if there's ever anything like that comes up, we talk about it. We actually talk about it in the sessions, and is it uncomfortable? I mean, we address it. Like if I'm working with someone and they're starting to there's some transference going on, there's some projection going on, we discuss it as part of the session, and we work on it, and we name it. And that's how I learned to work. Like people that worked with me were very straightforward and upfront and honest about here's what's going on here. Like, you're projecting on me because of X, Y, and Z. Here's some tools. Let's work on it, And so because I'm so open about sex and people know that they can talk to me about it, we address that stuff right away. Whereas, there can be somebody maybe running a spiritual community who's not talking about sex. And when those things come up, it's all vague and sort of hidden and doesn't get addressed in an honest, straightforward way. And then that leads to issues. So for me, I've always just been let's just rip the Band-Aids off and talk about it right up front when it arises. So I'm sort of the opposite of holding out on anything now, though there are still the things. I just recently peeled back another layer around my physical health. I've been dealing with chronic illness for many, many years, and it pretty much has only gotten worse up until really the last year. There started to be some improvement, and I just didn't want to really look at it. I didn't want to really look at it. I was using mindfulness to deal with pain, using my practice to kind of equanimize that, but I didn't really want to fully see the reality of the situation. And, reality has a way of bringing you to your knees ultimately. And that's what it's done for me. And I've had to truly look at it. So we all need people who can guide us and teach us and give us feedback and hold us accountable and help us look at the places that we're not seeing.
I'm going to jump in there. You said something, I think, sort of underlining that if we don't dig these areas up, if we don't turn our attention to these areas that we might not want to, there's resistance to, they have a way of pushing their way into life, whether that be ethical problems, like you're talking about the teachers whose sexuality is kind of not talked about, repressed, but then it comes out as a scandal. Me with eating, it might be something as simple as I was putting on weight. It's a very physical reality was happening here. It was you're not paying attention to that, and look what's going on, or a health issue. There's a way in which anything which we don't bring mindfulness to will scream and shout until we have to.
Yes, absolutely. That's been my experience anyway. For a lot of people, we need to hit bottom in areas before we're able to, start moving in a new direction. And, over the years, I don't always need to go all the way to the bottom to see something or learn something, but certainly some of my big lessons have come that way. And life's going to do what it does, and we can swim against that current and suffer like hell, or we can surrender and let life do what it's doing and take the lessons as they come and be willing to be shaped by what's actually happening.
And let's come back to mindful sex as our main topic. I first heard the term, it sounded kind of like a chore. It's like breath in, breath out. Okay, penis in, penis out. It sounded kind of okay. That has to be mindful too. It's already ruined my lunch break. I have to pay attention to everything. Maybe that's just my response when I first heard the term. But maybe jump off from there as a starting point.
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of people have that reaction. And it's it's like you had said earlier, it's another thing I've got to turn into work. It's another thing I've got to turn into a practice. And I totally get that. And that was my attitude with this stuff as well until it wasn't, until I was oh, it's not work. It's just being awake in this part of life too. And so I think, there's mindful sex for just, anybody There's the idea of just getting more present in the body, which is going to be a positive thing no matter what. And there's lots of different ways to do that. It doesn't have to, look like a meditation class. It can just look like, just bringing a little bit of attention to your genital area while you're having sex, coming back to that general area. And that's already going
to enjoy it more, if for nothing else, right? Like you're actually present, like your book subtitle. This is a nice subtitle, Getting Off Without Checking Out. Like, but the idea of checking out, you're not really there, so you can't really be enjoying it, right? There's in some future fantasy at best. Exactly.
And you're enjoying it as much as you're enjoying it at that time. And that's what I can say. Like, I had actually a pretty amazing sex life as a teenager, pretty adventurous, pretty fun. I had really great lovers, like as a teenager. But if I, look back at that now, it's like, wow, that was like completely checked out in all these ways. But at the time, it was great, and so we don't need to like judge our experience. It's more just like opening to the possibility that, it could actually be more pleasurable. It could be, there's so many possibilities. And so the beginnings of mindful sex is like learning to feel your body, let go of being trapped in the mind without trying to quiet those thoughts, just being like, oh yeah, there's some thinking and I'm going to come back to these sensations, maybe connecting visually with what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're tasting, what you're smelling. And that, really anybody can do that anytime, and it doesn't have to be a lot of work. It becomes work because we think we need to get it right. And there's it's not getting it right. It's just like exploring. This can be challenging because for so many people, there's a lot of trauma in the body. There's a lot of anxiety. There's, maybe there's issues within the relationship that they're not looking at, not being honest with themselves about. And all of this can cause a disconnect. So when you start to bring this basic mindfulness in, you do, just like where we started with like, it's going to destroy your life, it can start to change things, right? Because if you're super present with your body and your partner's doing the thing they've been doing for the last 5 years, and you're like, wow, actually, I hate this. Like, this doesn't feel good at all. I've just been sort of like gritting my teeth and making fists and waiting for it to be over. And I didn't realize that until I got mindful. Well, then, there's some hard conversations to have, but it'll be worth it. It'll be worth it because you deserve, to have I know you don't like that deserve phrase. I just, as I said it, but like
everything, Jessica, you deserve it well. It's not worth it.
Well, I think we deserve to have a satisfying, fulfilling sex life, and it is possible to do that. And everybody's coming from different backgrounds, so it's like it might be more work for one person than it is for another, just depending on what's going on there.
Well, I would certainly wish that for everyone who wanted that. There is the basic sort of mindfulness thing that mindfulness can increase pleasure, right? For example, we had a guy on who has from Germany, and he has people do a mindfulness exercise before they listen to classical music, and people say, "Wow, this music's fantastic. The violins have been tuned or something." He's like, "No, you've been tuned."
Yeah.
Gourmets who really pay mindful attention to food. There's a level of enjoyment that can be had there, which isn't available if you're watching TV and stuffing the food down. So I really get that sort of basic mindfulness, as you say, of the emotional patterns and the sort of putting up with crap sex things. I hear that more from women, if I'm honest, that there's that, this is kind of bad and I wasn't even really present to that, the sort of putting up with it. So getting present to what we actually want seems a big part of this, right, as well. Like, hey, I really enjoy being kissed there, but not so much there. Like, that's something that we're not really taught, right?
Oh, no, certainly not. We're not taught about pleasure in sex ed. We're barely taught about communication, except at, maybe some basics of consent. And I would just say that I know the circles you're in, the men are probably talking about sex more than a lot of them. But in a lot of cases, what I've noticed is that that's happening for men too. They're not enjoying what's going on sexually. There's just no place to really talk about it. They're not talking about it with each other. They're not talking about it with their partners, and they're not they're not talking about it. And so when I work with when I work with a male client, one of the things that's really healing about the experience is just to be able to say these things that they really haven't said to anyone else before. Mm-hmm. And I do find that, there are a lot of people of all genders who are just not really enjoying what they're doing. It's not really working for them. So I mean, the basics of mindfulness you can bring into anything, including into sex, and it will start to become automatic. It will start to become just the new normal. So it won't feel like work. It's not going to feel like, I'm being so mindful. Now that's anybody can do that. Now, if you're a meditation practitioner, if you're somebody who's like on a spiritual path, what I would say is that, let's say you've had an awakening in the realm of like non-separation, and you see like, okay, there's actually no separation between me and this tree I'm looking at, and it's not me that's waking up. It's this like beautiful dance of mystery. Why couldn't it be possible that could also express in sex? I mean, it kind of has to, right? And so with somebody who's more advanced, I would say it's actually a really cool thing when you notice that you're holding out. Like when you notice, here's the area where I don't want my awakening to touch. And because you're in store for some really cool stuff to happen. It might suck for a while. You might go through some dark night stuff, but ultimately, allowing the process of awakening to touch all aspects of life is only going to lead to a more profound experience of reality. And so whatever end of the spectrum you are, whether you're like super advanced practitioner or whether you're just like, I heard about this mindfulness thing, you can implement this stuff and it will have a profound effect.
So a quick interruption to let you know about some of the stuff we're doing outside the podcast. So the Embodied Facilitator Course and the Foundations of Embodiment certification, they're now running, so you can't get on those until next year. This year, if you're a yoga teacher, you can get on the Embodiment Body Yoga Principles online teacher training, which is eyp.training. And the main one I would say is to go to embodiedfacilitator.com and get on our newsletter list. Then you'll hear about all the free events we do. We do free events regularly, certain free ebooks. The podcast itself is there, all the videos, all the stuff we do related to the content on the show. If you want, as I said, ebooks, books, free trainings, we do things regularly on marketing, on trauma, on facilitation generally. That's all there. So go to embodiedfacilitator.com and have a look around there and get on the newsletter list so you hear about the different trainings and things we have happening. Thank you, and back to the show.
Yeah, what I enjoyed when I first came across your work was like, wow, here's somebody who's coming from a really solid mindfulness background with, solid mindfulness teacher I trust, Shinzen, maybe others too, rather than it wasn't sort of kooky, tantra-y, I have to get a new name and grow my hair long. And I was like, okay, great. So this is because of coming out of that meditation background already. It was like, okay, this transfers some stuff that I'm already familiar with into an area that might need a little bit of support. And so many people are doing mindfulness now. That kind of, I think, is a way in for people in a way that the general tantra scene is a huge turn off rather than a way in.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that's what I've wanted to be able to offer, is something that's accessible and something that's really inclusive, because not everybody is interested in using words like yoni and lingam, if I'm even saying those right. I mean, I think those are beautiful words for the people that relate to them, but not everyone relates.
They're terrible words. Just hit words, hit people. Just admit it. The truth.
I don't use those words. I don't think you'll find those words in my book. But yeah, not everyone's going to relate to that. Not everyone's going to relate to the sort of spiritual aspect. Not everyone wants to drink the Kool-Aid, right? Same thing with like orgasmic meditation. Same thing even with, some of the ways in which mindful sex is talked about. I mean, it can be very vanilla.
Dry. For here.
Yeah. Which, look, for the people that works for, great. Like for the scientific minded, and I'm not saying I'm not like into science, I am, but like for the people who are really into that and into a more sort of like into a very, very non-triggering experience of mindful sex, that's available to you.
Yeah.
What I want to offer is like, well, what about for everybody else who's not necessarily wanting to buy all into the tantra, who's not into the oming, who wants something a little bit, you know, a little bit less vanilla, a little bit less sterile. And that's what I try to offer. And you know what? The people that are into that find their way to me, and the people that think that's fucked up, you know, call me names on the internet.
There's on the one hand, we've got the Buddha. On the other hand, we've got a gag or an invitation to a threesome pie for some consensual choking. You know, there's
right.
two hands here, isn't there? We've got two hands.
Well, the thing that I always say that can, you know, some people love and some people get their feathers very ruffled is you can have a spiritual experience having love-making sessions with your partner of 20 years, monogamous, in a bed of rose petals and lotuses with like chanting playing in the background and you're eye gazing and you're breathing in sync.
I'm just falling asleep there, Jessica. Sorry. Or where else could one have...
Or you could also find a spiritual experience giving a stranger you met at a party a blowjob in the bathroom.
Awesome. When's this party? So, and do people get a bit triggered by that? That you're holding to both ends of that range, as it were.
Yeah, people get triggered by it, and you know, I'm not saying anything that I say to. Look, when I go and I speak or I teach, I start with resource. I start by helping everybody find a place in their body or outside of their body that feels safe, because I know the things I'm going to say, even just talking about sex in a very sort of scientific, dry way, can be triggering for people. And so I spend a lot of time creating a container of safety for folks because that's important to me. Yeah. But I also think it's important to speak from my unique perspective. I mean, that's my unique perspective. And again, it comes back to this idea of non-duality, that like, it's not just this, it's not. And we want to keep opening up to that possibility. And for the people who enjoy a casual fling or, you know, a one night stand or a blowjob in the bathroom at a party, they're like, well, really? This is for me too? Like, I get to have this too? And yes, you do.
Yeah, you're still on like a 6 out of 10 max here. This is Mark Walsh's Embodiment Podcast, Jessica. If you want to take it for a 9 out of 10, feel free. Just so you know. Okay, so let me push back, if that's not too graphic term, against this a little bit. So isn't part of the fun of sex that you get lost in it? Part of the fun of sex is you go, whoa, what the fuck just happened there? You know, not only I'm not sort of focusing my mindfulness on my genitals or anybody else's, that it's just being completely in the flow of it, completely lost in the experience of it. Isn't that what makes it so appealing? And second part of this question, isn't there also a parallel here with, you know, these oneness experiences? I mean, most people's only oneness experiences may be during sex. Some sports is the sort of second most popular one, I think. But many people have those merging experiences, which during awakening experiences will be with the couch and the wall and everyone, but at least with another human being, like during sex. So, you know, it doesn't sort of be paying conscious, deliberate attention, as mindfulness is often defined. I shouldn't then define it a bit broader. Isn't that going to ruin that? Isn't that the whole point?
Yeah. So, okay. So yes and no. The basic mindfulness, the just getting into your body and feeling the sensations, is really just the very beginning, right? Like that's just like a place to start. And that's for somebody who maybe has never done any meditation practice, just being in their body during sex is already going to create like a crazy peak experience. Over time, yeah, it's not going to be about focus on the sensation, focus on the sensation, focus on the sensation. It's going to be allowing yourself to start to notice all the movement and all of the flow in the body. It's going to be, you know, experiencing the flow and the movement in your partner's body. It's going to be opening your eyes and seeing your partner and your partner seeing you and the connection that can create. And over time, it can become a fully merged experience. And absolutely one of those wild what just happened experiences. And Yeah, my goal for folks is not that you can get like really good at concentrating on sensations while you're having sex. In fact, I was having lunch with a few colleagues not that long ago, and we were talking about, well, how do you practice mindful sex? And one of them was like, well, I use this technique, this technique, this technique, this technique, and like named all these techniques and specifics. And me and the other person were like, wow, that sounds really technical. Like doesn't necessarily sound like free. And so, yes, I mean, we don't want to mistake the what is the word, the map for the territory. I don't know. I'm saying the wrong thing. We don't want to get caught up in that in a way that's restricts us from actually having the experience. But you also asked, will it ruin it? Now, I think it's important to say, and actually Shinzen recently told me this should be my next book, is what happens when there's a disillusionment around sex? What happens when dark night of the soul, pit of the void infiltrates your sex life as well? Because when you bring mindfulness to something and you bring it again and again and again, you start to see the inherent emptiness of it. The flip side of that coin is the complete interconnection, the complete unity. But it can be quite sobering to see that this too is just made up of impermanent phenomena. Mm-hmm. And so when you bring mindfulness to something, that is a possibility that your relationship with it will change, and you will go through a period where it's not what it used to be. And then you have to discover, well, what is it now?
Yeah. I definitely had a bit of a disillusionment by being almost just Vipassana type. Okay, well, that's not an overwhelming bliss. That's just a set of sensations which come and go.
Mm-hmm. And then we can choose, like, how do we want to engage? So for me, finding the fulfillment and the connectivity in whatever aspect of life, that's the antidote. And so if you are going through like, wow, ever since I've been seriously meditating, I don't care about sex anymore. But maybe you have a partner who really does care about sex, right? Like, how can you start to re-engage? And for me, those words, fulfillment and connectivity, are the key. And you can lean into that, and that's a starting place.
Okay, so let's change track slightly because it's quite theoretical. Let's do sort of like top tips. Imagine this was a shallow program and there was, women's hour or whatever, top tips for people who go, what, I want to bring a bit more mindfulness to my sex life. Lay out a few little exercises that might be useful for people.
Sure. So number one, start a daily practice, even just 10 minutes a day, of observing sensations, observing thoughts, observing your internal experience. That's a great place to start. And you can use an app, or you can use YouTube, or you can read a book, whatever works for you. You can find a meditation teacher or coach. Start there, because the practice is what then allows you to bring it into your life and what allows you to bring it into sex. Then generally I like to have folks do some version of a mindful masturbation exercise, which is basically just treating it like a practice, setting a timer and beginning to explore the body and explore creating pleasure in the body without going right to the genitals and without going right into masturbation, keeping climax sort of not off the table, but not like the point of the exercise. And you just start to explore the body. You start to, touch your face, touch your lips, touch your arms, do different pressures, squeezes, strokes of your whole body, leaving porn, fantasy, and toys to the side for this exercise, not because they're wrong or bad, but just because they're not part of the exercise. And you just keep returning your attention to touching your body and feeling the sensations you're creating. And eventually, maybe during this 10 or 15 minute session, you start to masturbate, but you do it in a way that is brand new. You don't just go right to whatever your go-to movement is. And you just start to tune into pleasure. And for a lot of people, they discover new kinds of pleasure that they didn't know were available in their body. You can also discover pockets of sadness, pockets of, trauma. There's a lot that can be uncovered. So sometimes the practice turns into more of like a self-compassion practice. But for a lot of people, it's the introduction to actually becoming mindful about pleasure, mindful of pleasure in the body and mindful of sexual and sensual pleasure. And then after you've done that for a bit, you've practiced that for a little while, then bringing it into sex with a partner, if you have one, or somebody who's game to be your sex partner for the exercise, and you start to do the same thing. You just keep bringing your attention back to what you're actually experiencing in your body while you're engaging in a sexual activity. And I'm also a big believer in writing. I think that writing is another form of meditation, and certainly a form of mental process and emotional process. And so I generally encourage folks to do writing, to write after these experiences and just see what else comes up. So that's sort of that's a beginning for folks.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And what are the things you sort of see increasingly that people struggle with? Is it like, I just don't know what I like, or my partner wants more or less sex than me? Is it, I just don't enjoy sex? Like, why are people coming to you for coaching? What's the kind of normal reasons?
Well, it really varies. And not everybody comes to me for sexuality related stuff. But a lot of people do. And usually it is about having feelings of not good enough, feelings of I'm broken. There's a lot of people that think that they've because they masturbated too much as a teenager, they'll never have good sex, or because they, haven't had sex yet, they'll never have good sex. I've worked with a few people in that process of going from, never having had sex to having sex for the first time, which is a really cool process to be in with someone. And everything from that to I really want to start incorporating non-monogamy or threesomes. And, I want to do that in a mindful, conscious way. So it varies in that way. But I would say the number one issue that people are having is a battle with their mind. Their mind is saying, you're doing it wrong. You're not good enough, these sorts of things. And so for a lot of people, it's just about teaching them to untangle from those thoughts and get into the body. And then from there, there's all kinds of interesting threads to explore. But I would say that's the number one thing, a kind of orgasm anxiety and a sort of low self-worth and lack of self-compassion in the realm of sex and sexuality.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely one of those areas that should be called bodyfulness in many ways, isn't it? Because, my experience is nothing ruins an orgasm like the mind. You know what I mean?
Right.
Oh, what am I doing? Oh, there's that thing I have to do. Oh God, where was it? When the mind kicks in. I think for some women, this is almost like a fine thread that they have to really hold, and any little thing can happen, like the washing machine stops next door and all of a sudden their mind's off. And
sure. And the men have been taught to think about baseball, men have been there's this, think about baseball, think about your mother-in-law. These are sort of antiquated phrases, but the mind is actually a really powerful tool. And once you're no longer being used by it, once you're no longer being dragged around by it, you can use it. You can use the mind to have even better orgasms.
Yeah. And there's a lot of fantasy and a lot of sexism where people aren't really present. I think there's a kind of imagining something else, or there's a positive side to that, right? It can be that mental turn on is a big part of it. But then there's also a potentially not really being there with your partner kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Or even being there with yourself, being present with your own body. And I often get that question. Generally, when I speak, somebody will ask, can fantasy be incorporated into mindful sex? And it absolutely can be. It's just, are you conscious that you're in a fantasy? Do you have a choice about having that fantasy? Are you attached to it? Do you need it in order to feel pleasure during sex? Do you have shame around the fantasy that you're then burying? There's just, you can unpack it and sort of move towards fantasy that is conscious and, quote unquote, mindful. It's really just all about your relationship to it.
And I mean, you touched on trauma already, how people can be sort of not present to the body because of trauma, which can lead to sort of sex difficulties there. And I point listeners to Chana Cassell, who we had on, who did an episode on trauma and sex, which has been very popular, really talking about that. But maybe you could touch a little bit about on that subject as well, you know, people that aren't in their body because there's that trauma dissociation.
Yeah, so I think for anyone who is dealing with especially sexual trauma, it's important to have a lot of support going into this. I generally suggest to clients that they also work with a somatic experiencing therapist or an EMDR therapist. I'm not certified in any sort of trauma modality, but I have a lot of experience in it, so I incorporate it into the work that I do. But if someone's dealing with acute symptoms of PTSD related to sexual trauma, I'm always going to suggest that they get as much support and help as possible. And so mindfulness meditation is strong medicine, and it can wake this stuff up. And I think this is something that can happen like on a 10-day Goenka retreat. Someone goes and they don't even know they have trauma, and bam, they get hit by like this huge wave of childhood trauma and don't necessarily have the infrastructure in that type of retreat to support them through that. It wasn't one of my first retreats, but it was my first couple years of retreat. I was on retreat, and it was a monastic retreat, and I had a huge amount of sexual trauma surface in conjunction with a big insight experience. And they tangled up. And so the trauma, the fear of sort of death that I experienced as a 3-year-old when this thing happened, and the ego death fear got all tangled up, and it was really freaky. And there weren't necessarily teachers at that retreat who could support me through that, but I just used my phone. I just text my teachers, and they helped me through it. And then I did about a year of really intensive trauma work to address it. And so I think we want to take this stuff seriously and work on it, and address it in really conscious ways. But just learning to find pleasure in your body and focus on it can be an incredibly healing thing to do for trauma. Because we associate the body with pain and with shame and all of this. And if we can start to learn, actually there is pleasure in my body, and I can access it, and I can cultivate it, and I can teach my mind to focus on it. That's really, really empowering. And so I think pleasure in of itself is an incredibly healing modality. And then learning to find safety in the body in general, like that's a big part of how I work with people. Like it's one of the first things I do with someone when I have an intro call is I say, okay, let's take a moment and find something in your body that feels relaxed or even just neutral in the body that you can focus on. And we start there. And that's a way of starting to notice that, there's places in my body where there's not a problem, even if it's just the bottoms of my feet. There's no problem there. There's not like a trauma response there. And that's incredibly helpful for folks that are working through trauma to be able to have that tool of resource.
Yeah. And the pleasure meditation, I think I first heard from Shinzen Young, and you kind of took it to another level working with me. And these days I really, really enjoy just pleasure in my own body, often in a not particularly sexual way. I'll be rolling around on the floor, or a little self-stroking of the arms, or, people, even in fairly somatic environments, like free dance environments, don't often kind of go, but what the hell is he doing? And we're not talking masturbation here. We're just talking just enjoying physical pleasure in the body, like rolling on the floor or whatever. And, that is quite taboo still, the idea of self-pleasure.
Yeah, which is, which is really sad. What I noticed at this recent retreat I was at, everybody, during the breaks, there'd be these huge groups of people just out in the sun, standing there, like kind of like cats, and just like breathing and feeling the pleasure of the sun, and maybe gently swaying their body, maybe like, touching the body in some way. Nothing too overt, which, I think it speaks to what you're talking about. People are like a little uncomfortable to do that, which, I think could stand to change certainly. But I was watching everybody and I was doing the same thing. And I just love this. I just love that we're all here just acting like these cats in the sun. And so since coming back from retreat, like I've had this daily walk regimen that I've been doing. And I've been doing the like stand in the sun and sway. And I'm sure people are walking by like, okay, I don't know what's going on with her. But you know what I say? I say, fuck it.
Yeah.
Like engage in self-pleasure in ways that are obviously like, you know, because I teach around sexuality, sometimes I run into situations where people think that my workshops are going to be like sexual touch related, and people can sometimes be disappointed that they're not, or can start to want to go in that direction. And I have to be like, that's not actually what this workshop is. No. But you can feel free to engage with your body in other ways that are not sexual. And so I think that, you know, we need to model it. We need to model that level of embodiment. So I'm so glad that you're doing that. Like that is inspiring and really important. And I say, let's like embrace the pleasure activism, man, you know?
I've had a strange thing as a guy as I've hit middle age. So I was 40 last year. It's a sort of second wave of sex shame. Someone pointed this out to me, like a male friend said, hey, things that you used to do, you can't do anymore because you'll get seen as creepy. And I'm not talking about harassment or anything like that, but just as any kind of sexualized behavior as you get older as a guy. I don't know how it is for women, maybe the same, maybe different. So I've gone, there's this whole second wave of sex shaming that comes in. There's one that you have as a child, then another wave as a teenager. It's been pretty steady state for a while, you know? And then there's this other wave I'm experiencing, which is like, hey, you know, middle-aged guys are creepy, or maybe women have this like, you shouldn't be a cougar, you know, something like that. So it does, or old people shouldn't have sex, you know, maybe you're 60, I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like these different body life ages sex shames that get put on you.
Yeah, well, we'll see if I have the balls, but my plan is to continue my nude modeling into my old age, because for that reason, you know, to be like older bodies are absolutely sexy and sexual and can express themselves that way. It's sad that so many people live so much of their life in some kind of sexual shame or another, and it's not necessary. You know, it's not ultimately necessary, but it is kind of a warrior's path to say, I'm not going to buy into that shame. I'm not going to engage with that shame. I'm not going to live from that place of shame. Yeah. And at the same time, being conscious and mindful of how other people are affected by us, right? Like I've sort of chilled out a bit as I've gotten older. I used to really thrust my views about sex and sexuality on others in a way that maybe was confronting in a helpful way, but not always, you know. And I've learned that like I need to be authentically myself and express myself, whether that's as a teacher, as a speaker, as a coach, but also in my personal life, but not at the expense of somebody else's, you know, sweet, tender heart, you know? And so there's this balance between like, I'm not going to limit myself, and I'm going to be authentic, and I'm going to be aware that I'm part of a whole. And, you know, and that's a balance, and it's a balance. I continue to learn, as I, you know, walk this path of teaching around sexuality, because there's endless things to learn in that realm.
Yeah, and I think there is a line, isn't there, between sort of your own freedom and saying, look, I'm not ashamed to talk about this, and this is just part of life and no big deal. And as you say, thrusting it, as it were, into people. Like for me, like, do I really, like, occasionally I went through a stage of sort of going, okay, this one time in Russia, you know, and I'd give some example. Like, we don't really need to hear about Svetlana and Olga. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not really necessary to make the point, and we get it, and that's fine. And, you know, it's just like, where do we, it's almost a trend at the moment of walking very, very delicately because some people have trauma, and where do we say, hey, we're adults and we're robust? And this has come up on a few podcasts actually related to trauma, but I think it definitely is around this area of sexuality. You know, should I assume people are robust and are, you know, open to this conversation or not? Yeah, I mean, maybe we need to wrap up fairly soon. I realize we haven't just sort of said yet that just embodiment is good for your sex life, isn't it? And I mean, I don't know about you, but whenever I've done an embodied practice, I have much better sex afterwards. Just dancing for 2 hours, or whatever the embodied, martial arts class, and kind of feeling really yang afterwards, or even just any basic mindfulness practice in the body. I find that's one of the best things you can do to enhance your sex life. Is not necessarily exercise during sex, but just having a more embodied life. That seems for me to be one of the top things.
Absolutely, 100%. And I mean, for me, that's what led me into this whole idea of mindful, conscious sex, is that I really dove into mindfulness in an embodied practice of mindfulness. My main practice was being with emotions in my body, and so that's what led my body to kind of wake up and start to feel and experience in a way that it really hadn't for years. And so, anything you can do to get into your body is going to improve your sex life, I think, and then there's the mind, and there's, the blocks there. But yeah, dancing, I love that. It just brought up a memory of like when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I had this much older boyfriend, and I used to go out dancing, and he wouldn't come. And then he loved it because I would come home and I would be like, we would have this like amazing sex. And it just reminded me of that like, that was one of the things that I would do, even though I didn't have like a practice. I was not interested in meditation. I was super stressed out, but like I would go dancing, and that was kind of like the thing that would wake my body up. And so even if you're not ready to sit down and start meditating, like, as you said, there's different ways that you can start to get embodied. And just a little plug for your book. Your book gives some really great ways to do that. It's a wonderful handbook for how to get into your body, which can lead to better sex.
Well, thank you. It does seem that Amazon readers seem to agree, because customers who viewed good sex, getting off without checking out, also viewed Embodiment, moving beyond mind. It looks like, despite being in LA versus Brighton, we have some similar people going on there. Oh, you can now buy it used. Someone's already selling it used. There we go. Okay, so that's good to know. Yes, I had a Colombian ex used to say, Mark, I do not know why you like to go and hit other men in the head, but I like how you are afterwards.
That's great. I love it.
Okay, so dancing, martial arts, good for sex, embodiment, good for sex, good sex, the book available at Amazon and all other all good bookshops. Just anywhere people can find more about you. You do videos and live streams, don't you, as well? That's pretty good. Where else should people be kind of looking for your stuff?
Yeah, so people can find me on my website, yourwildawakening.com. And there's links for my YouTube, which I have a bunch of guided practices and full classes there and talks, and also my Facebook and my Instagram. So Facebook, I often teach a class on Sundays in Los Angeles, and when I teach it, I live stream it on my Facebook page. And then Instagram, there's a lot of content I put up on Instagram related to everything we're talking about. So and that's Jessica Clark Graham, but you can find all of that on yourwildawakening.com.
I can't, because I'm staying at an Airbnb and it blocks the website. Can you believe that? You haven't got through the parental settings, Jessica. That's
really?
A bad state of affairs. Yeah, worth knowing about, I would say. But yourwildawakening.com, it doesn't like it. It's blocked according to the parental settings, unless my wife has added them to my phone when I wasn't looking. It looks like it's the Airbnb. But let's hope.
Wow. Okay. Well, Shinzen has been really excited about China lately and like teaching in China. Yeah. And we were talking about it. He's like, well, you'd be blocked in China.
You'd be so
yeah, I know.
So much. If you're blocked there, it's pretty cool. Do you know what I mean? It's like the Sex Pistols album being banned. It's pretty cool to be blocked. So I take that as a positive. Jessica, final message.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Final message about the body for our listeners to finish up here.
There's no end to the journey, and there's no graduation point, and just keep going.
Gorgeous. Jessica, always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Embodiment Podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodiedfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. Most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodiedfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator Course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.